Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The paradox of the ravens, yet another formulation of Hempel's problem. The paradox appears under multiple names because different philosophers have formulated it independently or emphasized different aspects. And the paradox of the ravens is essentially identical to the paradox of confirmation and to the raven paradox, all referring to Hempel's discovery that observing non-black non-ravens logically confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And this formulation emphasizes the ravens themselves, emphasizes that the hypothesis is about a specific class of objects, ravens, and yet evidence can come from observing completely different objects, apples and shoes and clouds, and the paradoxical nature lies in this disconnect between what the hypothesis is about and what confirms it, between the subject matter and the evidence, and calling it the paradox of the ravens highlights this strange relationship, makes explicit that ravens are the subject of the hypothesis but need not be the subject of confirming observations. The multiplicity of names reflects the paradox's importance, its centrality to philosophy of science, because a problem this fundamental is rediscovered repeatedly, is approached from different angles, and each formulation brings slightly different emphasis, highlights different aspects of the puzzle, and some formulations focus on confirmation theory, on the formal logic of evidence, while others focus on scientific practice, on what scientists actually do when testing hypotheses, and still others focus on intuitions, on the clash between logical conclusions and common sense judgments. And all these perspectives are valuable, all contribute to understanding the paradox, and the proliferation of names is a sign of the paradox's richness, its ability to raise questions at multiple levels, from technical issues in confirmation theory to broad questions about scientific method. The paradox also connects to debates about Bayesian versus frequentist approaches to statistics and inference, because Bayesians have a ready answer to the paradox, can explain using Bayes' theorem why red apples confirm that all ravens are black, but provide only negligible confirmation, while frequentists struggle more, find it harder to explain the asymmetry between observing ravens and observing non-ravens. And this has led some philosophers to see the raven paradox as evidence for Bayesianism, as showing that Bayesian methods are better equipped to handle confirmation than classical approaches, though others argue that the paradox is not decisive, that various approaches can accommodate it with appropriate modifications. The paradox remains a standard topic in philosophy curricula, a problem that every student encounters, and despite its age, despite being formulated in the 1940s, it continues to generate discussion, continues to appear in new papers and books, because it is simple enough to explain quickly, deep enough to sustain extended analysis, and challenging enough that no solution is universally accepted. And this combination makes it pedagogically valuable and philosophically important, a paradox that serves both as an introduction to philosophy of science and as a topic for advanced research. The ravens circle overhead, black against the sky, and each sighting confirms what we already believed, that ravens are black, and elsewhere apples sit in bowls, red and green and yellow, and logic says these two are evidence about ravens, and the paradox persists, a permanent feature of confirmation theory, a problem that every account of scientific reasoning must address. And the paradox endures under its many names, always the same underlying puzzle, always the same challenge to explain how evidence works, what confirms hypotheses, and why common sense and formal logic sometimes diverge. And the paradox of the ravens remains, waiting for each new generation of philosophers to confront it, to propose solutions, to argue about confirmation, and to recognize that even basic concepts in science conceal philosophical depths that resist easy resolution. The predestination paradox. Time folds back on itself in strange ways, and among the strangest is the predestination paradox, a loop where an event in the past is caused by an event in the future, which is in turn caused by the past event, creating a circle of causation with no clear beginning. And yet, unlike other time travel paradoxes, this one involves no contradiction, only an unsettling sense that something is wrong with the very fabric of cause and effect. Imagine a historian who discovers an ancient artifact in a museum, a device whose origins are mysterious and unknown, and the historian becomes obsessed with understanding where it came from. And after years of research, they finally build a time machine and travel back to the era when the artifact should have been created. But upon arriving, they find no trace of it. No one has ever seen or heard of such a device. And in frustration, the historian accidentally leaves their own artifact behind in the past, where it is eventually discovered and placed in a museum, the very museum where the historian first found it centuries later. The artifact has no origin. It was never created. It simply exists in a loop, passed from future to past and back again, and the timeline is perfectly consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no contradiction, no paradox in the classical sense, and yet the mind recoils because it seems that something must have created the artifact, that objects do not simply exist without being made. The predestination paradox is closely related to the bootstrap paradox, but it emphasizes a different aspect of the problem: the idea that events can be predetermined by time travel, that the past is fixed not because of physical laws, but because travelers from the future have already shaped it, and any attempt to change history is doomed to fail because the changes have already happened. They are already part of the timeline. Consider a time traveler who learns of a great disaster and travels back to prevent it, but every action they take to stop the disaster instead contributes to causing it. Their warnings are misunderstood, their interventions backfire, and in the end, the disaster occurs exactly as history recorded. Because the time traveler was always part of that history. Their presence was always woven into the events, and there was never any other possible outcome. This raises profound questions about free will and determinism, because if time travel is possible, and the timeline is self-consistent, then perhaps the future is already written, every choice already made, every action already determined, and the feeling of free will is an illusion, a sensation that accompanies actions that were always going to happen, that could never have happened any other way. Some physicists embrace this view, arguing that the universe is a block where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, and that time travel simply reveals what was always true, that history is immutable, that the timeline is a fixed structure, and we are merely moving through it, experiencing events in sequence, but unable to alter them. Others find this vision disturbing, a denial of agency, a suggestion that nothing we do matters, because it has all already been decided, and they seek alternatives. Perhaps in the many worlds interpretation, where every time travel event creates a new branch, or in models where time is more fluid and the past can genuinely be changed, though such models often struggle to avoid contradictions. The predestination paradox also appears in ancient mythology and philosophy, in the story of Oedipus, who tries to escape a prophecy but instead fulfills it through his very attempts to avoid it, in the idea of fate and destiny that pervades many cultures, the sense that some events are meant to be, that the future shapes the past as much as the past shapes the future. The paradox lingers as a reminder that time is stranger than it appears, that causation may not be as simple as earlier leading to later, that loops and circles might be woven into the structure of reality, and that the question of whether the future is open or closed, whether we are free or determined, may be inseparable from the question of whether time travel is possible, And if so, what kind of time travel the universe permits? The problem of the many. A cloud drifts across the sky, its edges soft and undefined, fading gradually into the surrounding air. And a question arises that seems absurd at first. How many clouds are there? Is it one cloud, or is it many? And the answer is not as obvious as it seems, because the boundary of a cloud is vague, imprecise. And this vagueness creates a puzzle known as the problem of the many, a paradox about identity and indeterminacy that challenges our assumptions about what it means to be a single object. Consider the cloud more carefully. There is no sharp line where the cloud ends and the clear air begins. Instead, there is a gradient of water droplet density, thicker in some regions and thinner in others. And so we could draw the boundary of the cloud in many slightly different ways, each including or excluding a few droplets at the edges. And each such boundary defines a distinct aggregate of water molecules, and each aggregate has an equal claim to being the cloud. None is more privileged than any other, and so instead of one cloud there are millions of overlapping cloud candidates, each differing by just a few molecules, and all of them present at the same time in the same region of space. The problem generalizes to nearly every ordinary object. A cat sitting on a mat consists of trillions of cells and molecules, and the boundary of the cat is not precise. A few skin cells flake off constantly, a few hairs are loose, and so there are countless cat candidates, each differing slightly in which particles they include, and all of them have an equal claim to being the cat. And yet we do not say there are millions of cats sitting on the mat. We say there is one cat, and this creates a tension between our linguistic and conceptual practices and the metaphysical reality that seems to support vast multiplicity where we perceive unity. The paradox was articulated clearly by Peter Unger in the 1980s, though the underlying issue has roots in ancient philosophy, and it forces a choice between several unappealing options. One option is to accept that there really are many overlapping objects where we ordinarily think there is one. Millions of clouds and cats and tables all occupying nearly the same space, differing only by a few particles at the margins. Another option is to deny that ordinary objects exist at all, arguing that only fundamental particles or fields are real, and that clouds and cats are mere conventional designations we impose on complex arrangements of matter. And a third option is to embrace vagueness in the world itself, arguing that there is no fact of the matter about exactly which particles compose the cat, that the cat is a vague object with indeterminate boundaries. Though this raises difficult questions about the metaphysics of vagueness and whether reality itself can be indeterminate, or whether indeterminacy exists only in language and thought. Some philosophers argue that identity is conventional. That which aggregates counts as the cloud or the cat is determined by our practical interests and linguistic conventions rather than by objective facts. That there is no deep truth about where the cloud ends, only a question of what it is useful or natural to call a cloud in various contexts. And this view dissolves the paradox by denying that there is a genuine metaphysical problem, replacing it with a pragmatic question about how we choose to describe the world. Others insist that the problem of the many reveals a real difficulty in our ontology, that the world does not come pre-divided into discrete objects, that individuation is imposed by minds rather than discovered in nature, and that the apparent distinctness and unity of ordinary things is an artifact of perception and cognition rather than a feature of reality itself. The problem also connects to issues in vagueness and the Sauritz paradox, because if the boundaries of objects are vague, then questions like how many clouds are in the sky or how many hairs must a person lose to become bald have no determinate answers. And this suggests that much of our language is infected with indeterminacy, that most predicates do not have sharp extensions, and that the classical logical principle of bivalence, the idea that every statement is either true or false, may fail for a vast range of ordinary claims. The problem of the many lingers as a reminder that the world of discrete objects we navigate daily, a world of cats and clouds and people, may be a useful fiction, a conceptual overlay we impose on a reality that is far more fluid and indeterminate than it appears, and that the question of how many things there are may have no answer, or infinitely many answers, or no meaning at all depending on how we choose to carve up the continuous flux of matter and energy into countable, nameable entities. The Raven paradox, another name for the same strange logic. The paradox stands at the intersection of logic and intuition, bearing multiple names but always presenting the same fundamental puzzle. And the Raven paradox is simply another term for what Hempel called the paradox of confirmation, the same logical structure, the same counterintuitive conclusion that observing non-black non-ravens confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And the paradox is named after ravens because this particular example, chosen somewhat arbitrarily, has become the standard formulation, the canonical case study in discussions of confirmation theory. And ravens serve as the perfect illustration because the hypothesis all ravens are black is simple, clear, empirically testable, and the conclusion that red apples provide evidence for this hypothesis is maximally counterintuitive. And so the Raven paradox persists as a permanent fixture in philosophy of science, a problem that every theory of confirmation must address, a test case that separates adequate theories from inadequate ones. The paradox reveals something deep about the nature of scientific reasoning, about how we move from observations to generalizations, from data to theories, and the lesson is that confirmation cannot be understood purely formally, cannot be reduced to logical rules applied mechanically, but requires judgment, requires taking into account background knowledge, context, relevance, and the structure of inquiry, and different philosophical traditions respond differently. Bayesians appeal to prior probabilities and degrees of belief. Falsificationists focus on potential refutation rather than positive confirmation, and pragmatists emphasize the goals and methods of actual scientific practice, and each approach offers tools for handling the paradox, for explaining why ravens matter and apples do not despite the logical equivalence. And the paradox serves as a crucible, a test that theories of confirmation must pass, and many theories that seem plausible initially reveal inadequacies when confronted with the Raven paradox, fail to explain our intuitions, force counterintuitive conclusions, or require abandoning principles that seem essential to scientific reasoning. Visualize a scientist designing an experiment to test whether all ravens are black, and the scientist must decide what to observe, where to look, what data to collect, and the obvious choice is to find ravens and check their colour, to go where ravens live and observe them systematically. And no scientist would waste time observing apples or examining non-ravens, not because such observations are irrelevant in principle, but because they are inefficient, provide so little information relative to the effort required that they're not worth doing. And this practical irrelevance, this decision based on efficiency rather than logic, is what our intuitions track, and the paradox arises from confusing practical irrelevance with logical irrelevance, from thinking that because we should not observe apples in practice, apples must not provide confirmation in principle. And once we separate these two senses of relevance, the paradox loses some of its force, becomes less paradoxical, becomes a lesson about the difference between what logically confirms a hypothesis and what constitutes good scientific practice. The Raven paradox also illustrates the problem of GRU, the challenge of projectable predicates, because just as we face questions about what confirms hypotheses, we also face questions about which generalizations are legitimate, which patterns can be projected into the future. And these two problems are connected. Both involve understanding how observation relates to theory, how particular instances support general claims. And the Raven paradox is one manifestation of the broader problem of induction. The problem of justifying our inferences from observed to unobserved cases, and solving the Raven paradox completely would require solving the problem of induction, would require explaining how evidence works, how observation justifies belief, and this larger project remains incomplete, remains one of philosophy's central unsolved problems. The paradox endures because it is simple, because it uses everyday examples that everyone understands, ravens and apples and colours, and yet produces a conclusion that seems absurd, that violates common sense, and this combination makes it pedagogically powerful, makes it an excellent tool for teaching about confirmation and scientific method, for showing students that logic can lead to surprising places, that formal reasoning sometimes conflicts with intuition, and that philosophy of science is not obvious, not a matter of codifying what scientists already know, but involves genuine puzzles that require careful analysis to resolve. And the Raven paradox remains a standard topic in introductory courses, a problem that every student of philosophy of science encounters. And despite decades of discussion, despite hundreds of papers and books addressing it, the paradox retains its power to surprise, to challenge, to force recognition that confirmation is more subtle than it appears. The ravens fly, black against the sky, and somewhere a scientist notes another black raven, records it as confirming evidence, and elsewhere someone observes a red apple, and logic says this too is evidence about ravens. This too confirms the hypothesis, and the paradox persists, a challenge to our understanding of how evidence works. A puzzle that remains unsolved, not because no solutions have been proposed, but because every solution requires sacrificing some intuition, requires accepting some counterintuitive conclusion, or rejecting some seemingly obvious principle. And the paradox stands as a reminder that scientific method is not straightforward, that the relationship between theory and observation is complex, and that even basic questions about confirmation, about what counts as evidence, about how we learn from experience, remain philosophically problematic, and the Raven paradox endures. The surprise examination paradox. A teacher announces to a class on Friday afternoon that there will be a surprise examination sometime during the following week, and the examination will be a surprise in the sense that the students will not know on which day it will occur until the morning of the examination itself. And this announcement seems straightforward, even cruel perhaps, but harmless from a logical standpoint. Yet one clever student raises a hand and argues that the surprise examination is impossible, that it cannot occur, and the reasoning goes as follows. The examination cannot be on Friday, because if it has not occurred by the end of Thursday, then the students will know it must be on Friday, and therefore it will not be a surprise, and if Friday is ruled out, then the examination cannot be on Thursday either, because if it has not occurred by the end of Wednesday, then the students will know it must be on Thursday, since Friday has been eliminated, and therefore it will not be a surprise. And this reasoning continues backward through the week, eliminating Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday in turn, until the student concludes that the surprise examination cannot occur on any day of the week, that the teacher's announcement is self-contradictory, that a surprise examination is logically impossible. The class relaxes, confident in this reasoning, and then on Wednesday morning, the teacher administers the examination, and the students are indeed surprised, and this outcome seems to vindicate the teacher and refute the student's argument. Yet the student's reasoning appeared sound. Each step seemed to follow logically from the previous one, and so a paradox emerges. The surprise examination both is and is not possible. The student's proof that it cannot occur is seemingly valid, yet the examination does occur and is genuinely surprising, and philosophers and logicians have puzzled over this paradox for decades, proposing various resolutions but reaching no consensus. One approach is to question what surprise means, to argue that the student's reasoning equivocates between different senses of surprise or knowledge, that ruling out Friday does not give the students the kind of knowledge that would make Thursday non-surprising, because the teacher could change plans, could decide not to give an examination at all, could be mistaken about the week. And so even if the students can deduce that the examination must be on Thursday if it occurs that week, they do not know with certainty that it will occur, and this residual uncertainty preserves the possibility of surprise. Another approach focuses on the self-referential nature of the announcement, arguing that the student's reasoning involves a kind of paradox of self-reference, similar to the liar paradox, because the teacher's announcement refers to the student's knowledge state, claiming that they will not know when the examination occurs, and the student's reasoning attempts to derive knowledge about the examination from the announcement itself, creating a loop where the truth of the announcement depends on whether the students believe it, and this loop generates instability, making it impossible to consistently assign truth values to the claims involved. Still another approach suggests that the student's backward induction reasoning is flawed, that while it is true that the examination cannot be on Friday, if the students know this in advance, the elimination of Friday does not straightforwardly imply that Thursday can also be eliminated, because the reasoning that rules out Thursday depends on the students believing that Friday is ruled out. But if the examination could in fact occur on Friday, despite the reasoning, then the entire chain of deductions collapses. And this highlights a problem with self-fulfilling or self-defeating prophecies, situations where believing a conclusion affects whether the conclusion is true. The surprise examination paradox also connects to issues in epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because the paradox involves nested levels of knowledge. The teacher knows that the students do not know when the examination will occur, the students know that the teacher knows this, and so on, and reasoning about such nested knowledge structures is notoriously tricky, prone to paradoxes and fallacies, and formal epistemic logic provides tools for analysing these structures, but also reveals their complexity and the ease with which intuitive reasoning can go astray. The paradox has applications beyond the classroom, appearing in game theory and strategic reasoning, where players must reason about what other players know and believe, and where backward induction arguments, similar to the student's reasoning, are used to solve sequential games. But these arguments can lead to counterintuitive results, situations where seemingly sound reasoning produces predictions that are violated in practice, and the surprise examination paradox serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of such reasoning. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of surprise itself, whether surprise is a psychological state, a relation between expectations and events, or a logical property of statements and situations, and whether it is coherent to announce in advance that something will be surprising, because the act of announcing seems to undermine the surprise, yet in practice surprise examinations do occur and are surprising, and so perhaps surprise is not as fragile as the student's reasoning suggests. Perhaps it is compatible with some forms of foreknowledge, with knowing that something will happen without knowing when or how. The teacher's announcement, the student's reasoning, and the actual occurrence of the examination on Wednesday form a triangle of tension, each element seemingly incompatible with the others, yet all actually occurring, and the paradox remains unresolved, a puzzle that continues to generate papers and debates, a simple scenario that conceals deep issues about knowledge, belief, time, and the logic of self-reference. And it stands as a reminder that reasoning, even careful logical reasoning, can lead us astray when the premises involve reflexive concepts, when statements refer to their own truth or to the knowledge states of those who hear them, and that the gap between theory and practice, between what logic seems to prove and what actually happens, can reveal faults in our logical frameworks or in our understanding of concepts like knowledge and surprise, or perhaps in the very idea that logic can fully capture the complexities of situations involving human belief and expectation, and the examination comes unexpected despite the announcement, surprising despite the reasoning, and the students, shocked and unprepared, realize that the paradox is not merely abstract but painfully real, and the teacher smiles, victorious, having somehow managed to do the impossible, to give a surprise examination that was announced in advance, and yet remained a surprise, and the paradox endures, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a crack in the edifice of logical reasoning that no amount of analysis has yet managed to seal. The Swampman Paradox. Lightning strikes a swamp, and in that instant a man walking through the marsh is vaporized, his body reduced to scattered atoms. And by an extraordinary coincidence, the same lightning strike rearranges nearby organic matter into an exact duplicate of the man, molecule for molecule, synapse for synapse, every memory and personality trait perfectly replicated by chance. And this duplicate, called Swampman by philosopher Donald Davidson, who devised the thought experiment, opens his eyes and continues walking, unaware that anything has happened, believing himself to be the man who entered the swamp moments before. The question that follows is unsettling. Is Swampman the same person as the man who was destroyed? And if not, then what is he? Does he have thoughts, beliefs, desires? Or are his internal states merely physical patterns that resemble mental states without actually being mental states? And this paradox strikes at theories of meaning, content, and personal identity, revealing tensions between physical and historical criteria for mental properties. Davidson argued that Swampman does not have thoughts or beliefs, at least not initially, because the content of mental states depends on causal history, on how those states were formed through interaction with the environment and the linguistic community, and Swampman has no history, no past interactions, no causal connections to the world. His brain states are physically identical to the original man's, but they lack the historical grounding that gives those states their meaning. And so when Swampman seems to think about his wife, he is not actually thinking about anyone, because his internal states have no reference, no connection to the people and things they superficially resemble. This position reflects a broader externalist view in philosophy of mind, the idea that mental content is not determined solely by what is inside the head, but also by external relations, by the history of how beliefs and concepts were acquired, by the environment in which the organism evolved and learned, and so two physically identical beings could have different mental contents, or one could have mental contents while the other has none, depending on their causal histories. Others find this conclusion absurd, arguing that if Swampman is physically identical to the original man, then he must have the same mental states, that consciousness and thought supervene on physical structure, that duplicating the brain duplicates the mind, and that causal history, while perhaps relevant to the origin of mental content, is not necessary for its presence at a given moment. And so Swampman thinks and believes and desires just as the original man did. And any theory that denies this is privileging abstract historical facts over concrete present reality. The Swampman paradox also raises questions about personal identity. If Swampman is not the original man, then he is a distinct person who happens to have identical memories and personality, but those memories are false. They are not his memories because he did not live through the events they seem to record. He came into existence mere seconds ago with a fabricated past, and yet, from the inside, from Swampman's perspective, everything feels continuous and real, and he has no way of discovering the truth about his origins. And this suggests that memory and subjective continuity may be insufficient for personal identity. That being the same person requires some kind of physical or causal continuity that Swampman lacks. The paradox connects to debates about functionalism in philosophy of mind, the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by what they do and how they interact with other states, rather than by their physical composition or history. And functionalism seems to imply that Swampman does have mental states because his brain plays the same functional roles as the original man's brain, and yet this conflicts with externalist intuitions about content. The Swampman thought experiment has been used to explore issues in semantics, the philosophy of language, and theories of reference, showing that our ordinary assumptions about meaning and thought are more complex and fragile than they appear, that the relationship between words and world, between inner states and outer reality, is mediated by history and causation in ways that a snapshot of physical structure cannot capture. Swampman walks through the swamp, indistinguishable from the man who died, living a life that feels real, engaging in actions that seem meaningful, and yet, according to some theories, he is hollow, a zombie of sorts, a being without genuine content, without real thoughts, a perfect imitation of a person who is not quite a person, and the paradox lingers as a question about what makes mental states meaningful, what grounds reference and belief, and whether the inside of the mind is sufficient to constitute a mind, or whether minds require roots in history, connections to the world, threads of causation that link present thoughts to past experiences in ways that brute physical similarity cannot replace. The St. Petersburg Paradox. A casino offers a game with a simple rule. A fair coin is flipped repeatedly until it lands tails, and the player receives a payout that depends on the number of flips. If tails appears on the first flip, the payout is $2. If tails appears on the second flip, the payout is $4. If on the third flip, $8, and so on, doubling with each additional flip. And the question posed by the mathematician Daniel Bernoulli in 1738 is this: how much should a rational person be willing to pay to play this game? What is the fair price for a ticket? And the expected value calculation gives a shocking answer. The expected value is infinite, because the probability of tails appearing on the first flip is 1/2, and the payout is $2, contributing $1 to the expected value, and the probability of tails appearing on the second flip is 1/4, and the payout is $4, contributing another $1, and this pattern continues forever, each outcome contributing $1 to the expected value. And since there are infinitely many outcomes, the expected value is infinite. And yet no reasonable person would pay a large sum to play this game, let alone an infinite amount. And this gap between the infinite expected value and the finite amount people are actually willing to pay is the St. Petersburg Paradox, a puzzle that challenged the theory that rational agents maximize expected value and led to the development of expected utility theory and the concept of diminishing marginal utility. The paradox reveals that expected value, calculated as the sum of each outcome's value multiplied by its probability, may not be the appropriate guide for decision-making, because expected value treats dollars linearly, assumes that $10 is worth exactly 10 times as much as $1, and that $1 million is worth exactly 1,000,000 times as much. But this does not capture how people actually value money. For most people, the value of money exhibits diminishing marginal utility. The first dollar is worth more in terms of welfare than the second dollar, which is worth more than the third, and so on. And $1 million does not provide 1,000,000 times as much satisfaction as $1. And when utility, rather than dollar value, is used to calculate expectations, the St. Petersburg Paradox can be resolved. Because even though the dollar payouts grow without bound, the utility of those payouts may converge to a finite value, and so the expected utility of the game is finite, and a rational agent should be willing to pay at most that finite expected utility to play. Daniel Bernoulli proposed that utility is logarithmic in wealth, that the utility of having X dollars is proportional to the logarithm of X, and under this assumption, the expected utility of the St. Petersburg game is finite, and the fair price to play is modest, a few dollars perhaps, in line with what people are actually willing to pay. And this resolution saved the principle of expected utility maximization, showing that the paradox arises not from a flaw in decision theory, but from using the wrong measure of value, from confusing money with utility. And Bernoulli's insight laid the groundwork for modern economics and decision theory, which routinely assume that utility is concave in wealth, that people are risk-averse, that they prefer a certain outcome to a gamble with the same expected value, and that this risk aversion reflects diminishing marginal utility. But the St. Petersburg paradox has deeper layers, because even the expected utility resolution can be challenged. Mathematicians have constructed super St. Petersburg games where the payouts grow so rapidly that expected utility is also infinite, even under logarithmic utility or any concave utility function. For instance, if the payout on flip n is not 2 to the power of n dollars, but 2 to the power of 2 to the power of n, or some even faster growing function, then expected utility under any reasonable utility function will be infinite. And so the paradox reappears, and this suggests that the problem is not merely about the choice of value function, but about how to handle infinite or unbounded expectations. And some decision theorists argue that games with infinite expected value or utility are ill-defined, that they fall outside the domain of expected utility theory, that the theory was never meant to handle such cases and should not be faulted for failing to do so. Others propose alternative decision theories, bounded utility functions where utility approaches a maximum as wealth increases so that no payout, however large, has infinite utility, and under such functions all expected utilities are finite. And the paradox is avoided, or they propose maximum principles where the agent focuses on the worst possible outcome, or they appeal to considerations of probability and belief, arguing that rational agents should not assign positive probability to arbitrarily unlikely events, that there is some threshold below which probabilities are treated as zero, and this truncation of the probability distribution renders expected values finite. The paradox also raises questions about the feasibility of the game, because no casino could actually pay out arbitrarily large sums. The maximum payout is limited by the casino's resources, and once this limit is imposed, the expected value becomes finite, and the paradox dissolves. But this response feels unsatisfying, like avoiding the problem rather than solving it, because the paradox is meant to be a thought experiment about rational decision-making, not a practical question about casino economics. And thought experiments should not be dismissed simply because they involve idealizations. The St. Petersburg paradox connects to debates about rationality and the nature of value, about whether rationality requires maximizing expected utility or whether other principles should guide decision-making, about whether value is unbounded or whether there are limits to how much anything can be worth, about how to handle uncertainty and risk, especially when probabilities are very small and payoffs are very large. And these questions have implications far beyond gambling, for insurance, for investment, for policy decisions involving catastrophic risks like pandemics or asteroid impacts, where the probabilities are tiny, but the potential costs or benefits are enormous. And the paradox shows that expected value reasoning can give counterintuitive or unhelpful guidance in such cases, that we may need other frameworks, other ways of thinking about decision-making under extreme uncertainty. The coin is flipped, tails appears eventually, the game ends, the payout is made, and the player receives some finite amount, usually small, rarely large, almost never enormous, and the expected value calculated before the game began was infinite. But this infinity is never realized, never paid out, never experienced, and so the paradox asks whether infinite expected value is meaningful, whether it should guide decisions, whether a rational agent should treat an infinite expectation differently from a very large finite one. And the answers are not obvious, not settled, not agreed upon, and the St. Petersburg paradox remains a puzzle, a test case for decision theory, a challenge to the principle of expected value maximization, a reminder that infinity is strange, that unbounded sequences create problems, that mathematical idealizations can clash with practical intuitions, and that the gap between theory and behavior, between what agents should do according to formal models and what they actually do reveals something important about the limits of rationality, the role of psychology, the nature of value, and the difficulty of making decisions in a world where outcomes can vary wildly, where probabilities can be minuscule, and where the mathematics of expectation, taken to its logical extreme, produces results that seem absurd, untenable, impossible to act on, and the paradox endures, studied in classrooms, debated in journals, unresolved despite centuries of attention, a permanent fixture in the philosophy of probability, economics, and decision theory. The Simpsons paradox. A pharmaceutical company tests a new drug, comparing it to an existing treatment, and the study involves two populations, men and women, and when the results are analysed separately by gender, the new drug outperforms the old treatment in both groups. Men who take the new drug recover more frequently than men who take the old treatment, and women who take the new drug also recover more frequently than women who take the old treatment. And so it seems clear that the new drug is superior, effective for both men and women, better than the alternative, and yet when the data from both groups are combined, when the overall recovery rates are calculated across the entire study population, the old treatment appears to outperform the new drug, showing higher overall recovery rates. And this reversal, where a trend that holds in every subgroup disappears or reverses when the subgroups are combined, is Simpson's paradox, named after the statistician Edward Simpson, who described it formally in 1951, though the phenomenon had been noted earlier by others. And the paradox reveals how aggregating data can mislead, how the whole can tell a different story than the parts, and how statistical reasoning requires careful attention to confounding variables and the structure of causal relationships. The resolution of the paradox lies in understanding that the populations are not balanced, that more men than women take the new drug, or more women than men take the old treatment, or that the recovery rates differ between genders for reasons unrelated to the drugs. And this imbalance means that the overall average is dominated by the group with higher representation. And if men have higher recovery rates in general, and most men take the new drug, then the new drug will appear effective overall, even if it is actually less effective than the old treatment when gender is controlled for. Or if the distribution is skewed in other ways, the opposite reversal can occur. And the paradox shows that crude averages can be misleading. That Simpson's paradox occurs whenever there is a lurking variable, a confounding factor that influences both the treatment assignment and the outcome, and failing to account for this variable leads to incorrect conclusions. Consider a simpler example involving college admissions. Suppose a university has two departments, and Department A admits 70% of applicants, while Department B admits 30%. And when applications are examined by gender, it appears that the university discriminates against women, because the overall acceptance rate for women is lower than for men. But when the data are broken down by department, a different picture emerges. In Department A, which is less selective, a higher percentage of female applicants are admitted than male applicants, and in Department B, which is more selective, the same is true. Women are admitted at higher rates than men in both departments, and the overall appearance of discrimination arises because more women apply to Department B, which has a lower acceptance rate, while more men apply to Department A, which has a higher acceptance rate. And so even though women are favoured in both departments, they appear disfavoured overall. And this is Simpson's paradox. The confounding variable is the choice of department, which correlates with both gender and acceptance rate. And ignoring this variable produces a misleading aggregate statistic. The paradox has profound implications for how we interpret statistical data, for medical research where treatment effects can appear or disappear depending on how data are aggregated, for social science where trends in subgroups can reverse when combined, for legal cases where evidence of discrimination or bias can seem to vanish or appear depending on how populations are divided. And the paradox shows that there is no neutral or objective way to report statistics, that the choice of whether to aggregate or disaggregate, whether to control for certain variables or not, is a substantive decision that affects what conclusions can be drawn, and this decision should be guided by causal understanding, by knowledge of which variables are confounders and which are mediators, and this knowledge cannot be derived from the statistics alone, but requires background theory, domain expertise, and careful thinking about causal structure. Simpson's paradox also raises questions about the nature of causation and the relationship between correlation and causation, because the paradox shows that correlations can reverse when additional variables are considered, that associations in data are sensitive to what is held constant and what is allowed to vary, and this means that identifying causal relationships from observational data is more difficult than it might seem, that confounders must be identified and controlled for, that causal inference requires not just statistical analysis but causal modelling, the specification of hypotheses about how variables influence each other, and the paradox is one reason why randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard for establishing causation, because randomization ensures that treatment assignment is independent of confounding variables, breaking the associations that generate Simpson's paradox. The paradox appears in many real-world contexts. In sports statistics, where a player can have a better batting average than another player in every season, yet a worse average over their entire career, because they played different numbers of games in different seasons. In economic data, where wages can increase for every demographic group, yet average wages can decrease overall, because the composition of the workforce shifts toward lower wage groups. In epidemiology, where a treatment can appear harmful overall, yet beneficial in every subgroup, because sicker patients are more likely to receive the treatment, and in each case the paradox reveals the danger of naive data interpretation, the risk of drawing conclusions from aggregate statistics without understanding the underlying structure. Some philosophers and statisticians argue that Simpson's paradox is not really a paradox, but a reminder of the importance of causal thinking, that the appearance of paradox arises only when we treat statistical associations as if they were causal relationships, that once we distinguish between correlation and causation, between conditional independence and causal independence, the paradox dissolves, and the correct answer to whether the new drug is better than the old treatment depends on the causal structure, on whether gender is a confounder that should be controlled for or a mediator that should not be, and this depends on the mechanisms by which the drugs work and the reasons why gender affects recovery rates. Simpson's paradox has also been used to critique certain statistical practices, to question the use of aggregate statistics in policymaking, to highlight the need for transparent reporting of how data are broken down and what variables are controlled for, and to emphasize that statistical analysis is not a neutral technical exercise, but involves interpretive choices that reflect background assumptions and values, and different choices can support different conclusions, even from the same data. And this does not mean that statistics are arbitrary or that all interpretations are equally valid, but it does mean that statistical reasoning requires judgment, requires thinking about causal mechanisms, requires transparency about methods, and requires humility about the limits of what data alone can tell us. The data sit in tables, broken down by subgroups, aggregated across populations, and the numbers tell different stories depending on how they are arranged. And Simpson's paradox reminds us that statistics are not self-interpreting, that averages can mislead, that trends can reverse, and that understanding data requires more than calculation, requires causal reasoning, domain knowledge, and careful attention to structure. And the paradox persists as a warning, a puzzle that appears in textbook examples and real-world disasters, a reminder that numbers lie, or rather that we lie to ourselves when we treat numbers as transparent windows onto reality rather than as constructed representations that must be interpreted with care. And the reversal of trends continues to surprise, continues to catch analysts off guard, continues to generate misleading headlines and faulty policies. And Simpson's paradox endures, not because the mathematics is obscure, but because the temptation to aggregate, to simplify, to collapse complex data into simple averages is overwhelming. And the paradox stands as a permanent challenge to that temptation. A proof that simplification can distort, that the whole is not always the sum of the parts, and that statistical reasoning, done properly, requires vigilance, sophistication, and an understanding of causation that transcends mere correlation. The paradox of thrift. Saving money is virtuous, or so conventional wisdom holds. The careful individual who sets aside a portion of income, who resists the temptation to spend frivolously, who builds reserves against uncertain futures, is praised for responsibility and prudence. And yet there exists a paradox, articulated by economists and popularized by John Maynard Keynes, which suggests that if everyone tries to save more at the same time, the collective result is not increased wealth but decreased income, not prosperity but recession. And this is the paradox of thrift, a situation where individually rational behavior leads to collectively irrational outcomes, where virtue practiced universally becomes vice. The mechanism of the paradox operates through the relationship between spending and income in an economy, because one person's spending is another person's income. When you buy goods or services, you transfer money to the seller, who uses that money to pay employees and suppliers, who in turn spend it on other goods and services. And this circular flow of spending sustains employment and production. And if many people simultaneously decide to save more and spend less, then aggregate demand falls, businesses see reduced sales and respond by cutting production and laying off workers. And those who lose jobs or see reduced hours have less income, which forces them to reduce spending further, which causes more businesses to cut back. And this feedback loop drives the economy into recession. And in the recession, people earn less income, which means that despite their desire to save more, they may end up saving the same amount or even less than before, because their incomes have fallen. And so the collective attempt to increase savings fails. Defeated by the macroeconomic dynamics it sets in motion. The paradox challenges the microeconomic intuition that saving is always beneficial, that thrift is a virtue without qualification, and it reveals a divergence between individual rationality and collective welfare, a situation where what is good for each person taken separately is bad for everyone taken together. And this kind of divergence appears throughout economics, in the tragedy of the commons where individual overuse of shared resources leads to collective depletion, in the prisoner's dilemma where individual defection leads to mutually harmful outcomes, and in coordination failures where the inability to synchronize actions produces inefficiency. Keynes used the paradox of thrift to argue for government intervention during economic downturns, suggesting that when private sector spending collapses, the government should step in and increase public spending, running deficits if necessary to maintain aggregate demand and prevent the economy from spiraling into depression. And this idea became a cornerstone of Keynesian economics, influencing policy responses to recessions for decades, though it remains controversial, with critics arguing that government spending is inefficient, that deficits impose costs on future generations, that markets are self-correcting and will eventually restore full employment without intervention, and that the paradox of thrift does not apply in the long run because savings finance investment, which increases productive capacity and future income. The debate over the paradox of thrift touches on fundamental questions about how economies function, whether they are naturally stable or prone to instability, whether markets can coordinate the actions of millions of individuals efficiently, or whether coordination failures are common and require correction, and whether the behavior that is rational for individuals is also rational for society, or whether there are systematic conflicts between private incentives and public welfare. The paradox also raises ethical and philosophical issues, because if individual virtue can produce collective harm, then the relationship between ethics and outcomes becomes more complex. The action that seems right from a personal perspective may contribute to suffering when widely practiced, and this suggests that moral evaluation cannot focus solely on individual actions, but must also consider systemic effects, the ways that individual choices aggregate into social outcomes, and whether there are actions that are permissible or even obligatory for individuals, but disastrous if universally adopted. The paradox of thrift connects to issues of time preference and uncertainty, because saving reflects a preference for future consumption over present consumption, a willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future security, and this preference varies across individuals and across time, influenced by expectations about the future, by confidence in economic stability, by the availability of social insurance and safety nets. And when uncertainty increases, people tend to save more as a precaution, and this precautionary saving can trigger the paradox, can cause the very economic instability that people are trying to protect themselves against, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where fear of recession causes recession. The paradox also appears in the context of debt and deleveraging. When households or firms carry high levels of debt, they may all try to reduce their debt burdens simultaneously by saving more and spending less. And this collective deleveraging reduces aggregate demand and can cause a debt deflation spiral where falling prices and incomes make debt burdens even harder to service, leading to defaults and further economic contraction. And this dynamic was central to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial crisis of 2008, periods when the paradox of thrift was not merely a theoretical curiosity, but a lived reality affecting millions of people. Some economists question whether the paradox is genuine or whether it reflects a misunderstanding of economic dynamics, arguing that savings do not disappear from the economy but are channeled into investment. That when people save more, banks have more funds to lend to businesses for productive investments, and these investments create jobs and income, and so in the long run, increased saving leads to increased capital accumulation and higher living standards. And the paradox only appears in the short run, when there is a coordination problem, when the financial system fails to efficiently convert savings into investment, or when there is a liquidity trap where interest rates are already at zero and cannot fall further to stimulate investment. The paradox of thrift remains a central concept in macroeconomics, a reminder that economies are complex systems where individual actions interact in non-obvious ways, where feedback loops and emergent properties can produce outcomes that no one intended or desired, and where the aggregation of individual rationality does not necessarily produce collective rationality. And it stands as a challenge to simplistic economic thinking, to the idea that what is good for one is good for all, to the belief that markets automatically harmonize individual interests with social welfare, and it forces recognition that economic policy cannot be based solely on microeconomic principles, that understanding the economy requires attention to aggregate demand, to expectations and confidence, to the circular flow of income and spending, and to the possibility that individually prudent behavior can, under certain conditions, create collective disaster. And the paradox lingers as a warning that virtue is context-dependent, that actions are not good or bad in themselves, but only in relation to the circumstances in which they occur and the effects they produce, and that the attempt to secure individual futures through increased saving can, paradoxically, undermine those futures by damaging the economy on which everyone depends. The 5 phenomenon, why motion is an illusion your brain creates. 2 lights flash in sequence. First, one light turns on and off. Then a moment later, Another light nearby turns on and off. And yet what you perceive is not two separate flashes, but a single light moving from the first position to the second. Continuous motion where there is none. Smooth travel through space that never occurred. And this is the phi phenomenon, discovered by Max Wertheimer in 1912. A fundamental illusion that reveals how the brain constructs the perception of motion, shows that motion is not simply detected from sensory input, but is created, is synthesized by the visual system from discrete static images. And the phi phenomenon is the principle behind movies and television, where still frames flashed rapidly create the illusion of continuous motion, where characters seem to move smoothly when they are really just a sequence of frozen images. And understanding phi reveals that all motion perception involves construction, involves the brain interpreting changes and inferring movement. And motion is not a basic sensory property, but is a higher level interpretation. A perceptual inference that usually corresponds to reality, but can be fooled, can be triggered by appropriate sequences, even when nothing actually moves. And the phi phenomenon stands as evidence that perception is actively constructed rather than passively recorded, that what we see is not simply what is there, but is what the brain interprets as being there. Imagine the experimental setup. 2 dots on a screen, separated by some distance, and the first dot appears briefly, vanishes, then after a short delay, the second dot appears, and if the timing and spacing are right, you do not see 2 sequential flashes, but see 1 dot moving from the first position to the second, sliding smoothly across the space between them. And this apparent motion, this phi, is so compelling that it feels exactly like real motion, indistinguishable phenomenologically from watching an object actually travel through space. And yet nothing moved. No object traversed the gap. There were only 2 separate stationary flashes, and the motion exists only in your perception, is constructed by your brain from the temporal sequence. The phi phenomenon reveals that the visual system assumes continuity, assumes that when similar stimuli appear in nearby locations in rapid succession, they are probably the same object in motion. And this assumption is usually correct, is how motion in the real world works. Objects move continuously from place to place, and perceiving them as moving requires detecting this spatio-temporal pattern, and the visual system has evolved to detect this pattern efficiently, to infer motion from sequences of static retinal images, and phi exploits this mechanism, presents the pattern without the actual motion, and the brain responds as it normally does, constructs motion perception, and the illusion demonstrates that motion is not directly given in sensation, but is computed from changes in position over time. Visualize motion perception as involving motion detectors, neurons that respond to changes in position, to objects moving across the visual field, and these detectors can be activated by real motion or by appropriate sequences of static stimuli. And phi activates these detectors, creates the neural signature of motion without actual motion. And the brain cannot distinguish between motion signals caused by real movement and motion signals caused by phi sequences. And so phi creates genuine motion perception, creates the subjective experience of seeing something move. And this shows that motion perception is a neural state that can be produced by different causes, by real motion or by well-timed sequences. And the experience is the same, regardless of cause. The phi phenomenon differs from other apparent motion phenomena, differs from beta motion, which is pure displacement without phenomenal movement, differs from stroboscopic motion, which is the specific type of motion seen in films, and phi is the perception of smooth, continuous movement, is the most compelling type of apparent motion. Most closely resembles real motion, and understanding the distinctions between different types of apparent motion reveals the complexity of the motion perception system, reveals that there are multiple mechanisms, multiple ways the brain computes motion, and phi is one specific mechanism, the mechanism that creates smooth motion perception from discrete temporal sequences. Gestalt psychologists like Wertheimer used phi to argue against elementalist theories of perception, against theories that said perception is built up from simple sensations combined according to associations, and phi shows that perception is not a sum of elements, not a combination of two flashes, but is a holistic interpretation, is motion that emerges from the relationship between flashes, and the whole is different from the sum of parts. And this Gestalt insight-shaped psychology influenced how perception came to be understood as involving organization and interpretation rather than simple sensation. And phi became a canonical example, a demonstration that perception is constructive, is synthetic, creates experiences that go beyond the sensory input. The phi phenomenon also has philosophical implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you experience in phi is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion, and yet no motion occurred in the stimulus. And this raises questions about the relationship between experience and reality, about whether experiences are always caused by corresponding physical events. And phi shows they are not, shows that the same experience can be caused by different physical processes, by real motion, or by sequential flashes. And this supports functionalist theories of consciousness, supports the view that conscious experiences are not tied to specific physical substrates, but are computational states that can be realized in multiple ways. One implication of phi for film and animation is that smooth motion can be created with relatively low frame rates. As long as frames are spaced appropriately in time and space, the phi phenomenon will create smooth motion perception. And this is why movies work at 24 frames per second, why television works at similar rates. The temporal gaps between frames are short enough that phi fills them in, creates continuous motion, and filmmakers exploit phi to create realistic movement, to make still images come alive. And understanding phi has been crucial to developing motion picture technology, to optimizing frame rates and timing. Another implication concerns perceptual boundaries, concerns what counts as seeing motion versus what counts as inferring motion, because phi feels like seeing motion, feels like direct perception, not like making an inference or having a belief. And yet phi is constructed, is synthesized by the brain from discrete inputs, and this raises questions about where perception ends and cognition begins, whether the boundary is sharp or gradual, whether there are clear distinctions between seeing and thinking, or whether perception shades continuously into cognition. And phi sits on this boundary, is simultaneously perceptual, immediate, and phenomenologically direct and cognitive, involving complex processing and interpretation. The lights flash in sequence and motion appears, smooth travel from first to second, and nothing moved, only the brain moved from sensing to interpreting, from input to output. And phi emerges, motion created from stillness, continuity created from discontinuity. And the phenomenon reveals the constructive nature of perception, reveals that experience is not a mirror of reality, but is a model constructed by the brain, a model that usually tracks reality accurately, but can be manipulated, can be triggered by artificial sequences. And the phi phenomenon endures as one of the foundational discoveries in perceptual psychology, a demonstration that motion is not given but is made, is not detected but is computed, and every motion you see, real or apparent, involves this same computation, this same construction. And phi makes the construction explicit, shows that what seems most immediate, most directly perceived, is actually mediated, is processed, is inferred, and motion is an illusion, a useful, accurate illusion usually, but an illusion nonetheless. And phi reveals this and the lights flash on. The phantom limb. Paradox, why missing body parts still feel present. A soldier loses an arm in combat. The limb is amputated, no longer exists, no longer is connected to the body, and yet the soldier feels the arm, feels it present, feels sensations in fingers that are not there, feels the arm moving, feels it itching, feels pain in the missing hand. And this sensation is vivid, is compelling, is indistinguishable from sensations in real limbs. And this is the phantom limb phenomenon experienced by the vast majority of amputees, where missing body parts continue to be felt, continue to be represented in consciousness. And the paradox is that the brain maintains a representation of a limb that no longer exists, continues to generate sensations attributed to that limb, continues to include it in the body schema, despite clear evidence from vision and from direct inspection that the limb is absent. And this persistence reveals something deep about how the brain constructs body representations, shows that body schemas are not simply reflections of current physical structure, but are neural constructs that can outlive the body parts they represent. And phantom limbs demonstrate that the sense of embodiment is generated centrally, is maintained by brain processes that do not require peripheral input. And the phenomenon raises questions about the relationship between body and brain, about how sensations are localized, about what it means for a body part to be yours when that part no longer exists. Imagine the experience from the inside. You lost your hand months ago. The physical hand is gone, and yet you feel it. Feel the fingers, can feel yourself making a fist, opening the hand, moving fingers that are not there. And these phantom movements feel exactly like real movements, involve the same motor intentions, the same kinesthetic sensations. And sometimes the phantom hand is in uncomfortable positions, cramped or twisted, and you cannot move it, cannot relieve the discomfort. And this frozen phantom is intensely frustrating, is painful, because you feel the limb but cannot control it, cannot adjust it. And the pain is real, is neurological, is generated by the brain but is felt as coming from the missing hand. And this localization is puzzling because there is no hand, no physical location where the sensations could be occurring. And yet the sensations are localized there, are felt as arising from a specific spatial location that happens to be empty. The phantom limb phenomenon reveals that body representations are maintained in the somatosensory cortex, in the motor cortex, in the parietal lobe, and these representations do not simply disappear when a limb is removed, do not automatically update to reflect the new body configuration, and instead the neural circuitry that represented the limb continues to be active, continues to generate activity patterns that are interpreted as sensations in the missing limb, and this persistent activity is what creates phantom sensations, is what maintains the feeling of presence and understanding. This has led to treatments, has led to therapies that attempt to reorganize the somatosensory cortex to reduce phantom pain by providing feedback that the limb is gone, and mirror therapy, where amputees use mirrors to create the visual illusion that the missing limb is present, has proven effective, helps reduce pain and unfreeze frozen phantoms by providing visual feedback that allows the brain to update its body representation. Visualize the somatosensory cortex as containing a map of the body, a homunculus where different regions represent different body parts, and this map is established during development, is maintained throughout life, and when a limb is amputated, the corresponding region of cortex does not simply go silent, does not become inactive, and instead neighbouring regions begin to invade, begin to colonize the deferented cortex, and inputs from the face or from the remaining arm begin to activate what was formerly hand cortex. And this reorganization is rapid, occurs within weeks and creates strange effects. Touching the face can produce sensations in the phantom hand. Stroking the cheek can feel like stroking the missing fingers. And this shows that the cortical representation has been invaded, that face inputs now activate hand cortex, and the sensations are still localized to the phantom because the activity occurs in hand cortex, and the brain interprets activity in hand cortex as indicating sensations in the hand regardless of the actual source of the activity. The phantom limb paradox challenges the idea that sensations are simply caused by peripheral stimulation, shows that sensations can be generated centrally, can arise from brain activity without corresponding peripheral events. And this has implications for understanding pain, for recognizing that pain is not simply a signal from damaged tissue, but is a constructed experience that can occur without tissue damage and chronic pain. Phantom pain, neuropathic pain are all examples of centrally generated sensations, are pains that arise from neural processes rather than from peripheral injury. And understanding phantom limbs helps understand these pain conditions, helps develop treatments that target the central nervous system rather than the periphery. The phenomenon also raises philosophical questions about the extended mind, about whether the body is part of the mind or is merely a tool used by the mind, and phantom limbs suggest that the body representation is part of the mind, is a core component of self-representation, and the representation persists even when the body part is gone. And this shows that the mind includes representations of the body, includes body schemas that are not simply passive reflections of physical structure, but are active constructs that shape experience. And the phantom limb is a representation without a referent, is a body part in the mind, but not in the world. And this dissociation shows that minds represent bodies, and representations can outlive what they represent. One variant of phantom limbs occurs in congenital amputees, people born without limbs, and some congenitally limbless individuals report phantom limbs, report feeling limbs they never had. And this is surprising, suggests that body schemas are not entirely learned, are not simply acquired through experience with actual body parts, but have some innate component, are partly specified by genetic programs that establish expected body structure. And when these programs run, they generate representations of limbs, even when those limbs never existed. And this shows that body schemas are not simply empirical generalizations from sensory experience, but are structured expectations about what bodies should be like. And the brain generates these representations even in the absence of corresponding body parts. Another implication concerns prosthetics, because if phantom limbs persist, if amputees continue to feel missing limbs, then prosthetics should be designed to interface with these phantom sensations, should provide feedback that is integrated with the phantom, and neuroprosthetics that read motor intentions from the brain or from remaining nerves can be controlled by the phantom, can allow amputees to move prosthetic limbs by moving their phantom limbs. And this creates a seamless interface, allows natural control, and the phantom limb, rather than being a problem, becomes a solution, becomes the interface between brain and prosthetic. And understanding phantoms has been crucial for developing advanced prosthetics that feel natural, that are experienced as extensions of the body rather than as external tools. The phantom also appears in other contexts: phantom breasts after mastectomy, phantom genitalia after surgery, phantom teeth after extraction, and all these phantoms reflect the same underlying mechanism, the persistence of neural representations after the represented body parts are removed. And the generality of the phenomenon shows that it is not specific to limbs, but applies to any body part. And body schemas for all body parts can persist as phantoms. And this universality suggests that phantoms reveal a general principle about how brains construct body representations, how these representations are maintained centrally, and how they can become dissociated from physical reality. The amputee feels the hand, phantom fingers that are not there, phantom movements that cannot occur, phantom pain in a location that does not exist, and the paradox persists. The brain maintains a representation despite the absence of the represented, and phantom limbs reveal that bodies are represented in brains, that these representations are stable, are resistant to updating, are constructed during development and maintained throughout life, and removal of body parts does not remove their representations, and the phantom remains, felt but not present, localized but not located, moving but motionless. and the paradox endures as one of the most striking phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that consciousness includes representations that can outlive their reference, that sensations can be generated centrally without peripheral causes, and that the body we feel is not simply the body we have, but is the body the brain represents. And sometimes these diverge and phantoms emerge, ghostly presences of absent limbs, and the phenomenon persists. The Preface Paradox. An author completes a lengthy scholarly work, a book synthesizing years of research, containing hundreds of individual claims about history, science, or philosophy, and the author has carefully checked each claim, believes each one to be true, based on the available evidence, and yet in the preface, the author writes something like this: "Despite my best efforts, I am certain that this book contains errors, that some of the claims I have made are false, and I apologize in advance for any mistakes that careful readers may discover." This acknowledgement is standard, even expected in academic writing, a gesture of intellectual humility, an admission that no human work is perfect. That error is inevitable in any sufficiently complex undertaking, and yet this creates a paradox, because the author believes each individual claim in the book believes that claim 1 is true, that claim 2 is true, that claim 3 is true, and so on for all the claims, and belief is usually thought to be closed under conjunction, meaning that if you believe each of several propositions, then you should believe their conjunction. And so the author should believe that all the claims in the book are true, and yet the author also believes that at least one of the claims is false, that not all of them are true, and these two beliefs are contradictory. And so the author holds contradictory beliefs, and this seems irrational. Yet the author's behaviour seems entirely reasonable. Both the individual beliefs and the belief that some of them are false seem justified. And so the preface paradox reveals a tension between rationality and consistency, between what it is reasonable to believe and what logic says about the relationships between beliefs. The paradox was first articulated clearly by David Mackinson in 1965, though related issues had been discussed earlier, and it challenges the principle that rational belief is closed under conjunction, that if you rationally believe P and rationally believe Q, then you must rationally believe P and Q, because in the preface case, the author rationally believes each claim individually, but rationally believes that their conjunction is false, or at least that the conjunction is likely to contain errors. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that it is possible to rationally believe many individual propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the number of propositions is large and the probability that each is true, while high, is less than certainty. Because if each claim has a 99% chance of being true, then a book with 100 claims has only about 37% chance of having all its claims be true, and so it is perfectly rational to believe each claim while doubting that all are true. Another response is to distinguish between degrees of belief, arguing that the author assigns high credence to each individual claim, perhaps 99%, but assigns lower credence to the conjunction of all the claims, and that there is no contradiction here, only a recognition that confidence decreases as the number of independent claims increases. And this response draws on probabilistic or Bayesian approaches to rational belief, where belief comes in degrees rather than being all or nothing, and where the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts, if they are independent, and so the probability that all claims are true can be much lower than the probability that any particular claim is true. A third response is to argue that the author's belief in the preface, the belief that the book contains errors, is of a different kind than the beliefs in the individual claims, that it is a higher order belief about the author's own fallibility rather than a first order belief about the subject matter of the book, and that there is no direct contradiction between believing that you are generally fallible and believing specific claims, just as there is no contradiction in a weather forecaster believing that their forecasts are occasionally wrong, while believing that today's forecast is correct. The preface paradox connects to broader issues in epistemology about the nature of rational belief, the role of evidence, the significance of consistency, and whether it is possible for a rational agent to knowingly hold inconsistent beliefs. And while inconsistency is generally considered a mark of irrationality, the preface paradox suggests that there are cases where inconsistency, or at least apparent inconsistency, is unavoidable, and perhaps even required by rationality, because to refuse to acknowledge the possibility of error when error is statistically almost certain would itself be a form of irrationality, a failure to properly calibrate beliefs to the evidence. The paradox also relates to the lottery paradox, another puzzle about rational belief and probability, where you rationally believe of each ticket in a large fair lottery that it will not win, but you also rationally believe that some ticket will win, and again rational belief seems to violate closure under conjunction, and together these paradoxes suggest that the classical logical picture of belief, where beliefs are consistent sets of propositions closed under logical consequence, may not accurately capture how rational agents actually form and maintain beliefs in conditions of uncertainty. The preface paradox has practical implications for how we think about knowledge and expertise, because it suggests that experts, even while justifiably confident in their individual judgments, should maintain an overall humility about the possibility of error. And this humility is not a sign of weakness or uncertainty, but a recognition of the statistical reality of human fallibility. And it supports practices like peer review, replication, and open debate, all of which are mechanisms for catching errors that individual researchers, despite their care and expertise, are likely to make. The paradox also raises questions about the ethics of assertion and testimony, about what it is permissible to assert or to claim as knowledge. Because if the author knows that the book contains errors, in the sense of being confident that at least one claim is false, then is it honest to present the book as if all the claims are true, or should every claim be hedged with qualifications and caveats? And if so, would this not make communication impossibly cumbersome? And yet, if we present claims without hedges, do we mislead our audience? Do we pretend to a certainty we do not possess? And these questions have no easy answers, and different contexts may call for different standards of assertion, with scientific writing allowing for the acknowledgement of fallibility in a way that courtroom testimony or medical diagnosis may not. The author sits with the completed manuscript, proud of the work yet aware of its limitations, believing each sentence yet doubting the whole, and this dual attitude, far from being irrational, seems to be the mark of a careful and honest thinker, someone who takes seriously both the evidence for individual claims and the statistical likelihood of error. And the preface paradox forces recognition that rationality is more complex than simple consistency, that the principles governing rational belief must accommodate uncertainty, fallibility, and the limits of human cognition, and that sometimes the rational response to evidence is to hold beliefs that are, in a technical sense, inconsistent. And this inconsistency is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature of how finite minds navigate an uncertain world. And the paradox remains a puzzle that challenges our theories of rational belief, that resists easy resolution, and that reminds us that even the attempt to be perfectly rational, perfectly consistent, perfectly certain, is itself a kind of error, a failure to recognize that error is inevitable, that certainty is elusive, and that the best we can do is to believe what the evidence supports, while acknowledging that some of what we believe must, almost certainly, be false. The problem of other minds, how you know anyone else, is conscious. You observe a person crying, tears streaming down their face, and you infer that they are sad, that they are experiencing the subjective feeling of sadness, the inner emotional state. And this inference seems natural, seems obvious, but philosopher Bertrand Russell asks what justifies it. What evidence proves that other people have minds, have consciousness, have inner experiences like yours? And the evidence is purely behavioral. You see the tears, hear the words, observe the actions, but you never directly experience another person's consciousness, never feel their pain or see their thoughts. And so the inference from behavior to consciousness is not logically certain, cannot be proven beyond doubt. And it is logically possible, conceivably, though perhaps not believably, that other people are unconscious automata, zombies who behave as if conscious but have no inner life. And this possibility, however remote, reveals that our knowledge of other minds is inferential, is based on analogy to our own case. And this is the problem of other minds. The epistemological challenge of justifying our belief that other people are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, that they are not merely sophisticated mechanisms producing behavior without accompanying phenomenology. Imagine trying to prove that someone else has consciousness, trying to establish with certainty that they have subjective experiences, and you observe their behavior, see them wince in pain, hear them describe their feelings, watch them respond appropriately to stimuli, and all this behavior is consistent with consciousness, is what we expect conscious beings to do, but it is also consistent with unconsciousness, with sophisticated programming that produces appropriate responses without any inner experience, and there is no test, no observation, no experiment that directly reveals consciousness, that proves beyond doubt that someone else has subjective experiences, and so the inference to other minds is always uncertain, is always vulnerable to skeptical doubt. And while we do not actually doubt that other people are conscious, while the skeptical scenario seems absurd, the philosophical point is that our belief cannot be proven, cannot be established with the certainty we might desire. The problem of other minds rests on the asymmetry between first-person and third-person access to mental states. You have direct access to your own consciousness, immediate awareness of your own thoughts and feelings, but you have only indirect access to others' consciousness, can only infer it from their behavior and their reports. And this asymmetry creates an epistemological gap, a gap between what you can know with certainty about yourself and what you can know about others, and crossing this gap requires inference, requires reasoning from observed behavior to unobserved mental states. And such inference is never certain, always vulnerable to error. The traditional solution to the problem of other minds is the argument from analogy, which says that I observe a correlation in my own case between mental states and behavior. I know that when I am in pain, I exhibit certain behaviors. When I am sad, I cry, and so on. And I observe that other humans exhibit the same behaviors. And by analogy, I infer that they have the same mental states, that when they exhibit pain behavior, they are in pain. And this analogy is strengthened by the similarity between my body and their bodies, by the fact that we share similar physiology, and so it is reasonable to infer that we share similar mental lives. But critics of the argument from analogy point out that it is based on a sample size of one. On my own case, and generalizing from one case to all cases is weak induction. And moreover, the analogy assumes what it sets out to prove, assumes that behavioral similarity indicates mental similarity, and this assumption is precisely what the skeptic challenges. Visualize the epistemic situation. You are confined to your own consciousness, your own first-person perspective, and everyone else exists outside this perspective, exists as objects in your experience rather than as subjects with their own experiences. And the question is how you know that these objects are also subjects, also have inner lives, and the answer cannot be certain, cannot be proven, can only be inferred with greater or lesser confidence. And this realization that our knowledge of other minds is uncertain is one of the permanent features of the human epistemic situation, a gap that cannot be fully closed. Another approach to the problem of other minds appeals to the best explanation, argues that the hypothesis that other people are conscious, that they have minds, is the best explanation of their behavior, that positing consciousness explains why people speak as they do, why they report experiences, why they act purposefully, and so on. And while the zombie hypothesis, the hypothesis that people lack consciousness, is logically possible, it is not plausible, not the best explanation, and so we are justified in believing that other people are conscious, even though we cannot prove it with certainty. And this response treats knowledge of other minds as a theoretical inference, as a hypothesis confirmed by evidence, rather than a conclusion proven with certainty. A third approach, associated with Wittgenstein, questions the framework of the problem, argues that the idea of privately checking whether another person is conscious is confused, that consciousness is not a hidden inner property that might be present or absent while behaviour remains the same, but is manifested in behaviour, is constituted by appropriate responsiveness, and there is no gap between behaviour and mind, no possibility of zombie-like creatures that behave as if conscious but lack consciousness, because consciousness just is the pattern of appropriate behaviour, and the problem of other minds dissolves, because it is based on a misunderstanding of what consciousness is, treats it as an inner object rather than as a pattern of life. The problem of other minds connects to debates about artificial intelligence, about whether machines could be conscious because the same epistemic situation applies. We observe the behaviour of AI systems, see them generate text, respond to questions, exhibit apparently intelligent behaviour, and the question arises whether there is consciousness behind the behaviour, whether the machine has subjective experiences, or whether it is merely processing symbols without understanding, and our inability to solve the problem of other minds for humans makes the question of machine consciousness even more difficult, even more uncertain, and we face the possibility that we may never know whether AI is conscious, may never be able to prove or disprove machine sentience. The problem also has practical implications for how we treat non-human animals, for whether they have consciousness, feel pain, deserve moral consideration, and our evidence is behavioural. We see animals exhibit pain behaviour, avoid harm, seek pleasure, and we infer that they are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, but the inference is uncertain. Is more uncertain the more different the animal is from us, and the problem of other minds makes it difficult to establish definitively which animals are conscious, which can suffer, which deserve protection. You see the person crying, and you believe they are sad, and you comfort them, and the interaction proceeds as if their consciousness is real, as if their suffering matters. And practically, this is enough. Socially, this is how we function. But philosophically, the question remains, how do you know? How can you prove that they are not a sophisticated zombie, that there is really someone home behind the tears? And the answer is that you cannot prove it, can only infer it, can only trust in analogy and explanation, and the shared form of life that suggests consciousness is universal among humans. And the problem of other minds persists, not as a practical obstacle, but as a philosophical recognition of the limits of knowledge, the gap between self and other, between first-person certainty and third-person inference. And the problem endures as a permanent feature of epistemology, a reminder that some things cannot be known with certainty, that consciousness is private, that the inner life of another remains always partially hidden, always known only through the indirect evidence of behaviour and report. And the crying continues, and the inference to sadness continues, and life proceeds, and the problem remains, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a gap that defines the epistemic situation of embodied minds, trying to know other embodied minds, and the question persists, how do you know anyone else is conscious? And the honest answer is, you do not know with certainty. You only believe with confidence but without proof. And this uncertainty is part of what it means to be human, to be a conscious being among what you believe are other conscious beings, but can never know for certain. The repugnant conclusion, why creating billions of barely happy people seems better. A utilitarian philosopher sits with a calculator attempting to determine which world is best, which future humanity should aim for, and the principle guiding the calculation is simple. Maximize total happiness, create the most good, ensure that the sum of well-being across all people is as large as possible. And this seems like a reasonable goal, seems like an obviously good principle. Who could argue against making the world contain more happiness rather than less? And yet when this principle is applied consistently, when the logic is followed to its conclusion, the result is deeply counterintuitive, deeply troubling. And this troubling result is called the repugnant conclusion, first articulated by philosopher Derek Parfit. And it says that for any world containing a population of people living excellent lives, lives of great happiness and fulfillment, there exists a better world, according to utilitarian calculation, containing a much larger population, living lives barely worth living, lives that contain only slightly more happiness than suffering. And the second world is better, because even though each person is much less happy, the total amount of happiness is greater due to the vastly larger population. And this conclusion seems repugnant, seems to violate our intuitions about what makes a world good, and yet it follows logically from the principle of maximizing total happiness. Imagine World A, containing 1 billion people, and each person lives a wonderful life, a life filled with love and beauty and meaning and joy, a life worth living many times over. And the total happiness in this world is enormous. And now imagine World Z, containing 1 trillion people, and each person's life is barely worth living, contains just slightly more pleasure than pain, just enough satisfaction to make existence preferable to non-existence, but not much more. No deep relationships, no profound experiences, just a thin layer of positive feeling spread across a vast multitude. And when we calculate total happiness, World Z wins, because even though each person is much less happy, there are so many more people that the total sum is greater. 1 trillion barely positive lives sum to more total happiness than 1 billion excellent lives. And according to the utilitarian principle that says we should maximize total happiness, World Z is better than World A. We should prefer it, should work to bring it about. And this seems absurd, seems like a reduction to absurdity of the maximizing principle, and yet the logic is impeccable, follows directly from the idea that goodness is total happiness. Visualize the choice as a graph. On one axis is population size, on the other axis is average happiness per person. And World A has high average happiness and moderate population, and World Z has very low average happiness but enormous population. And the area under the curve represents total happiness, and World Z has more area, more total happiness, despite having much lower average happiness. And the repugnant conclusion says we should prefer the world with more area, more total happiness, even though this means accepting a vast population of people whose lives are barely worth living. And this seems to violate basic intuitions about human dignity, about quality of life, about what it means to create a good world. Because most people would rather live in World A, would rather be one of the 1 billion living excellent lives than one of the 1 trillion living barely positive lives. And a theory that says World Z is better seems to have gone wrong somewhere. Parfit called the conclusion repugnant because it seems to endorse a world that intuitively seems worse, seems to recommend creating vast populations, living lives of minimal quality, and this conflicts with our sense that what matters is not just total happiness, but how that happiness is distributed, how good each person's life is, whether lives are worth living in a robust sense, rather than barely scraping by. And the paradox forces a choice: either accept the repugnant conclusion and bite the bullet, admitting that yes, World Z really is better, and our intuitions are wrong, or reject total utilitarianism, reject the principle that all that matters is total happiness, and adopt some alternative that avoids the conclusion. But every alternative has costs, has its own counterintuitive implications. One response is to adopt average utilitarianism, which says what matters is not total happiness, but average happiness per person. And by this measure, World A is clearly better than World Z, because the average person in World A is much happier, and the repugnant conclusion is avoided. But average utilitarianism has its own problems. It implies that we can improve the world by killing unhappy people, because removing people whose happiness is below average raises the average. And this seems even more repugnant than the original conclusion. An average utilitarianism also implies that a world with one extremely happy person is better than a world with 1 billion moderately happy people, as long as the single person's happiness exceeds the average of the billion. And this seems wrong, seems to sacrifice too much for the sake of avoiding one counterintuitive conclusion. Another response is to adopt variable value principles, where the marginal value of adding a person depends on the quality of their life. Creating people with excellent lives adds more value per person than creating people with barely positive lives. And this can avoid the repugnant conclusion by making World A better than World Z, despite having fewer people, because the excellent lives contribute more value per person. But this approach requires specifying how the marginal value changes, requires drawing lines about which lives add how much value. And these lines seem arbitrary, and the approach faces technical difficulties, can generate cycles where A is better than B is better than C, and C is better than A, creating intransitive preferences that undermine rational choice. A third response is to reject consequentialism entirely, to argue that what matters is not just outcomes, not just how much happiness exists, but also rights, dignity, fairness. And these values are not captured by summing happiness and creating a world of 1 trillion people. Living barely worthwhile lives might maximize total happiness, but violates something important about human dignity, about what it means to respect persons. And this deontological response avoids the repugnant conclusion by appealing to values beyond happiness. But it must explain what these values are, how they are weighed against happiness, and whether they really should override considerations of total welfare. The repugnant conclusion also raises practical questions about population ethics, about how many people should exist, about whether we have obligations to create future people, and if so, what quality of life they should have. And these questions are not academic. They affect policy decisions about climate change, resource allocation, family planning, and sustainability. Because if creating more people is good, as long as their lives are worth living, then we should maximize population growth up to the point where additional people would lower everyone's quality of life below the barely worth living threshold. And this seems to recommend creating enormous populations living in poverty, which seems wrong. And if instead we think population should be limited to ensure high quality of life for each person, then we are rejecting total utilitarianism in favor of some other principle. And we need to say what that principle is and why it is right. Parfit himself was troubled by the repugnant conclusion, spent decades trying to find a population ethic that avoided it while remaining plausible, and he proposed various principles, but none fully satisfied him. And he concluded that population ethics is one of the hardest problems in moral philosophy, a domain where all theories seem to have deeply counterintuitive implications, and perhaps there is no fully satisfactory answer, no principle that aligns with all our intuitions, and we must choose which intuitions to preserve and which to sacrifice. And this choosing is itself a moral judgment, requires deciding what values are most important, and different people will make different choices based on different weights. They give to total happiness versus average happiness versus rights versus dignity. The calculator sits on the desk. The numbers are clear. World Z has more total happiness than World A. The calculation is not in doubt. And yet something rebels, something in us rejects the conclusion, insists that World A is better, that a world of 1 billion excellent lives is preferable to a world of 1 trillion barely positive lives, even if the total sum of happiness is less. And this rebellion reveals that our values are more complex than simple maximization, that we care about distribution, about quality, about more than just the sum, and the repugnant conclusion stands as a challenge to utilitarianism, as a reductio ad absurdum that forces reconsideration of the maximizing principle, and Parfit's legacy includes this unsolved problem, this paradox that shows the difficulty of systematizing our moral intuitions, the challenge of finding principles that match our judgments, and the repugnant conclusion remains, repugnant and unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of consequentialist ethics. A reminder that maximizing happiness may not be as simple or as obviously right as it first appears. The skeptical paradox. The ancient skeptics posed a question that has haunted philosophy ever since. How can we know anything at all? How can we justify our beliefs about the external world when those beliefs rest on foundations that are themselves uncertain, when every justification requires further justification in an endless regress? And this is the skeptical paradox, the problem that knowledge seems both necessary for action and impossible to achieve, that we cannot help but believe and claim to know, yet we cannot provide the kind of justification that would ground those claims in certainty. The skeptical argument takes many forms. One of the most powerful begins with the observation that our beliefs about the external world are based on sensory experience. We believe there is a table in front of us because we see it and touch it. But sensory experience can be misleading. Illusions and hallucinations occur. Dreams feel real while we are dreaming them. And so the mere fact that we have a certain experience does not guarantee that the world is as the experience represents it. And this means that our sensory experiences underdetermine our beliefs about the world. The same experiences could be produced by a real table, by a hallucination, by a detailed dream, or by a Cartesian demon systematically deceiving us. And if we cannot rule out these skeptical scenarios, then we cannot know that the table is real. And this reasoning applies to all our beliefs about the external world. None of them are certain. All are vulnerable to skeptical doubt. The skeptic does not claim to know that we are deceived, only that we cannot know we are not deceived. And this is enough to undermine knowledge, because knowledge seems to require not just true belief, but justified true belief. And justification seems to require being able to rule out relevant alternatives. And the skeptical scenarios are relevant alternatives that we cannot rule out, at least not without begging the question, not without assuming the very thing we are trying to prove, that our senses are reliable, that the external world exists, that we are not dreaming or deceived. The skeptical paradox is that we seem to have two incompatible intuitions. On the one hand, we are convinced that we know many things, that we know there is a table in front of us, that we know we have hands, that we know the earth is round, and these beliefs seem as certain as anything could be. And on the other hand, we find the skeptical arguments compelling. We recognize that we cannot prove we are not deceived, that the possibility of systematic error cannot be ruled out by any non-circular reasoning. And so, we oscillate between certainty and doubt, between the conviction that skepticism is absurd and the recognition that we cannot refute it. Descartes attempted to escape skepticism through his method of doubt, doubting everything that could be doubted until he reached the indubitable foundation, cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am, the one truth that even the most radical skepticism cannot undermine, because to doubt that one exists is to presuppose that there is someone doing the doubting. And from this foundation, Descartes tried to rebuild knowledge, proving the existence of God and using God's benevolence to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. But few philosophers have found this reconstruction convincing. The arguments for God's existence are controversial, and even if successful, they would not close the gap between subjective certainty and objective truth, between what seems clear and what actually is. Hume took skepticism more seriously, arguing that we have no rational justification for believing in causation, induction, or the existence of an external world, that these beliefs are products of custom and habit rather than reason, that we believe because we cannot help but believe, because our psychology compels us, not because we have good arguments. And Hume distinguished between philosophical skepticism, the theoretical position that knowledge is impossible, and practical certainty, the psychological inevitability of belief and action. And he suggested that we can acknowledge the force of skeptical arguments in the study while setting them aside in ordinary life. Though this division between theory and practice remains uncomfortable, a kind of intellectual schizophrenia where we admit that our beliefs are unjustified, yet continue to hold them anyway. Kant responded to Hume by arguing that skepticism rests on a mistake, the assumption that knowledge requires correspondence between our representations and things as they are in themselves, independent of our cognitive faculties, and Kant argued that this assumption is incoherent, that we can only know things as they appear to us, as structured by the forms of intuition and the categories of understanding, and that the question of how things are independently of these structures is meaningless, not answerable even in principle, and so skepticism about the external world is based on a confused demand, a demand for a kind of knowledge that is conceptually impossible, and Kant's transcendental idealism attempts to secure the objectivity of knowledge by relativizing it to the conditions of possible experience, making knowledge possible by making it more modest, more limited, no longer claiming to grasp things in themselves, but only things as they appear within the framework of human cognition. Contemporary epistemology has developed various responses to skepticism. Externalist theories argue that knowledge does not require the ability to rule out all skeptical scenarios, that knowledge requires only that beliefs be produced by reliable processes or track the truth in certain ways. And on these views we can know we have hands, even if we cannot prove we are not brains in vats. Because in the actual world, our perceptual beliefs are reliably formed, and the fact that we cannot distinguish the actual world from a skeptical scenario does not undermine knowledge as long as we are in fact in the actual world, and our beliefs are in fact reliably formed. Contextualist theories argue that the standards for knowledge vary with context, that in ordinary contexts skeptical scenarios are not relevant, and we can truly claim to know many things, while in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are explicitly raised, the standards become more demanding and knowledge claims become false. And this allows us to preserve both the intuition that we know many things in everyday life, and the intuition that skeptical arguments are powerful in philosophical inquiry, by treating these as claims about knowledge in different contexts with different standards. The skeptical paradox remains unresolved. No consensus has emerged about how to respond to skeptical arguments, and different philosophers find different responses more or less satisfying depending on their broader commitments about the nature of knowledge, justification, and the mind's relationship to the world. And the paradox continues to drive epistemological theorizing, forcing philosophers to clarify what they mean by knowledge, what conditions must be met for a belief to count as knowledge, and whether the concept of knowledge we ordinarily employ is coherent or whether it contains internal tensions that cannot be fully resolved. The skeptic sits in doubt, questioning everything, unable to claim knowledge, yet unable to stop believing, and the rest of us navigates between confidence and uncertainty, acting as if we know, while acknowledging in quieter moments that our knowledge rests on foundations that are less secure than we would like, that the gap between appearance and reality cannot be fully closed, that the possibility of error cannot be eliminated, and that knowledge, if it exists at all, is more fragile and more difficult to achieve than common sense suggests. And the paradox endures, the ancient puzzle that will not die, the question that philosophy cannot answer but cannot stop asking, and we continue to believe, to claim to know, to act with confidence, While the skeptic watches and waits, reminding us that certainty is elusive, that doubt is always possible, that the foundations of knowledge are shakier than they appear.